In 1428, an English army commanded by the kingdom's most formidable general, the Earl of Salisbury, arrived at the French town of Orléans. This marked a turning point in the 100 Years' War between the kingdoms of France and England. In 1428, England had the upper hand, and the attack on the strategically important city of Orléans was meant to devastate French resistance. But France had an ace up its sleeves. A warrior maiden, instructed by divine visions, was to unite the kingdom's people and give them fresh hope. Orléans was the siege that made the famous Joan of Arc a leader, a national hero, and ultimately a legend. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Orléans. In 1415, King Henry V of England resumed the 100 Years' War against France by invading Normandy. He decisively defeated the French at the Battle of Agincourt in October, and then began to occupy large stretches of territory in northern France. Henry greatly profited from the civil war between the two cadet branches of French royal family, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, who were vying for power when King Charles VI, also known as the Mad, began showing signs of mental illness. In 1418, with pressure from England rising, the Burgundians and Armagnacs arranged peace negotiations. However, when John I of Burgundy met with Charles, heir apparent to the French throne, carrying the title of Dauphin and head of the Armagnac faction, one of Charles's followers assassinated John. This shattered any hope for reconciliation, and even worse, prompting John's son, Philip III of Burgundy, to join forces with England. At this point, France was in a state of utter despair. Devastated by nearly a century of warfare, torn apart by civil war, partly under foreign occupation, with a shattered economy and barely productive agriculture due to armies living off the land, France was a mere shadow of its former glory. Nevertheless, there was still hope. Somewhere in rural France, a young peasant woman named Jeanne, or Jeanne, had been having visions of saints telling her to free France of the English scourge. But few believed her yet. A girl saving the kingdom was unimaginable. To make matters worse, in 1420, the unstable Charles VI, influenced by Philip, who wanted to steer the crown away from the Dauphin, signed the Treaty of Troyes, by which his daughter Catherine would marry Henry V of England, and their children would inherit the French crown. This left the Dauphin entirely on the defensive, as he was declared illegitimate. When both kings, Henry V and Charles VI, passed away in 1422, Henry's infant son, Henry VI, was crowned King of England and France. John of Lancaster, the Duke of Bedford, was appointed regent of the French kingdom. Nevertheless, as the historian John Hendrickson explains, many French remained loyal to the Dauphin. The war continued. In 1428, Thomas Montagu, the 4th Earl of Salisbury, widely regarded as England's most competent military commander, was poised to strike at the heart of the Dauphin's territory and end any resistance. The most promising target was Orléans, a thriving city situated at the northernmost point of the Loire Valley. Orléans was of strategic importance and held great symbolic value. Its capture would be a catastrophe for the Dauphin, perhaps even decide the 100 Years' War for good. Accordingly, Salisbury and his army of approximately 10,000 soldiers marched south from France in late summer. They captured several towns before crossing the Loire at Beaugency and turning north on the opposite shore. On the 7th of October, Salisbury halted at Olivet, 3 kilometers south of Orléans. By then, his army had dwindled to about 4,000 men because ongoing battles, desertions, and the need to garrison conquer towns constantly strained his troops. Such a small force was by far not adequate to lay siege to a city like Orléans. But if anyone could still succeed, it was the experienced Earl of Salisbury. Salisbury formally began the siege of Orléans on the 12th of October, when his men began to patrol the city's surroundings to prevent the defenders from receiving reinforcements. However, the bastard of Orléans, John of Dunois, who was governing the city in the absence of the imprisoned Duke of Orléans, had closely observed the English approach and had already prepared the defences, filled the granaries, and called upon a militia. Although the exact numbers of defenders is hard to determine, it is clear that the citizens participated very actively in the defense, so that a sizable force manned the sturdy medieval walls. The bastard of Orléans understood that a bridge across the river Loire in the south, which connected the town to the other shore, was the weak spot of the defense. He reinforced the southern gatehouse, called Les Tourelles, with a boulevard, a low-lying earthen bulwark equipped with artillery, and leveled the suburbs south of the river. And indeed, it was the southern gatehouse Salisbury attacked. On the 17th of October, the English opened fire on the earthen boulevard first. After it had fallen quickly, they turned to the gatehouse itself, which proved harder to breach. Because of this, Salisbury had his men dig their way under the fortification. But before they reached the gate, the defenders suddenly retreated to the city. And when Salisbury entered the gatehouse, he saw that the defenders hadn't been idle either. They had worked hard to tear down the bridge behind them. Salisbury won the gatehouse, but was no step closer to the city. In the meantime, the rest of the English troops began establishing several boulevards, some 600 meters from the city walls. But the besiegers were too few to isolate Orléans completely. They couldn't cover much of the northern side of the city, so that the only obstacle in some places were the Bois d'Orléans forest and some swarming English patrols. While this encirclement prevented slow convoys of food and material from entering, it could not stop more mobile armed reinforcements. With boulevards and patrols in place and the Tourelles occupied, the English were in a more comfortable position. But the comfort wouldn't last. Some days later, the sources disagree whether it was the 17th or 24th of October, the Earl of Salisbury was monitoring the defense from one of the upper windows when suddenly a cannonball smashed into the window ledge, and a piece of the metal window frame hit his face. The surgeons did everything to save him, but the blow removed much of his jaw and lower face, so that the English bearer of hope passed away 8 days later. Salisbury's death was a harsh blow to the English, as there was no equally capable commander to take his place. According to the military historian Kelly de Vries, it appears that any serious attempt to capture the city died with Salisbury. His successor, William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, limited himself for the time being to bombarding the town and reinforcing the boulevards. Clearly, the English had altered their strategy and were now waiting for the city to surrender due to starvation, bombardment, or desperation. But the people of Orléans were determined not to give in without a fight. Therefore, they actively contributed to the defense. According to de Vries, they even launched sorties without the participation of the soldiers, which was rather extraordinary. Despite their resilience, it was clear that the people of Orléans could not hold out against the English besiegers without outside help. While it's challenging to determine when and how many reinforcements arrived, a significant French force, including the renowned veteran La Hire and his troops, had made it into the city by Christmas. Despite their increased numbers, the bastard of Orléans remained cautious and even hesitant. He and La Hire launched several sorties during the winter of 1428 and 1429, but none achieved anything of substance. In contrast, the besiegers received further reinforcements from Burgundy. While this had already demoralized the defenders, an even more severe setback came in early February. Throughout the siege, the English troops relied on supplies from their northern territories, particularly Paris. Recognizing the importance of this supply chain, the bastard of Orléans traveled to Chinon and proposed to the Dauphin an ambush on one of the convoys. This would both weaken the English and provide much needed food for the townspeople. The Dauphin was fond of the plan and sent an army of 3,000 to 4,000 men to attack a supply train carrying fish, which is why the upcoming battle was named the Battle of the Herrings. The ambush initially seemed promising, as the French cannons inflicted heavy damage on the English wagon fort. But the tides turned when the Scottish infantry charged forward, forcing the gunners to pause in order to avoid friendly fire. Subsequently, they ran into the fire of the English longbowmen behind the wagon fort and their infamous field stakes and were badly defeated. The same fate awaited the French cavalry, which was charging forward to support the Scots. The French quickly turned to flight when the English finally launched a counterattack against their disordered enemies. The ambush had failed, and the starving townspeople had to watch as the fish was delivered to their besiegers. As a result, the morale of the city plummeted. The situation was so desperate that the bastard of Orléans even opened negotiations with Philip III of Burgundy. He offered to surrender the city to him instead of the English. Philip should govern the town in the place of the imprisoned Duke of Orléans and get half its taxes in return for peace. The only condition was that Orléans would remain neutral ground. Philip was excited about this advantageous offer and tried to convince the Duke of Bedford of it. But the English regent felt confident that Orléans would fall soon anyways, and denied Philip the opportunity. According to the medieval historian James Anthony Pollard, Philip was so affronted that he withdrew his troops from the siege on the 17th of April 1429. Another plan of the defenders had come to nothing. At this dire moment, a shimmer of hope appeared from an unexpected source. The young peasant girl previously mentioned had gained increasing recognition and had become associated with various prophecies circulating in rural France that predicted a virgin maiden would come to save the country. She was known as La Pucelle, the maid. In 1428, she approached Robert of Baudricourt, the commander of the nearby Vaucouleurs garrison, and asked him to take her to the Dauphin. At first, this demand from a simple peasant amused Baudricourt, and he refused. But when her fame kept growing, he eventually agreed to take her to the Dauphin. When John met the future king at Chinon, she left a lasting impression. She announced that her visions had commanded her to raise the siege of Orléans and escort Charles to Rheims, where he should be crowned King of France. To verify her trustworthiness, John was sent to Poitiers, where a committee of theologians examined her claims, and then to Tours, where a group of court ladies confirmed her virginity. Upon her return to Chinon, only one question remained unanswered. Were her visions truly of divine origin? This would be put to the test by sending her to relieve Orléans. News of the help sent from heaven reached Orléans in February and gave the people hope again. They eagerly awaited John, and the young woman too was aching to begin her mission. In her famous letter to the English, John announced her objective and unwavering determination to complete it. While the English were not impressed at all, the spirits of the French were soaring. To the people, John seemed a miraculous hero sent by God to liberate Orléans and then all of France. While these beliefs may have surged spontaneously, the expert on Joan of Arc, Juliet Barker, emphasizes that the Dauphin put the full weight of his propaganda machinery behind the maid and staged her on purpose. This had a tremendous effect. The people of France believed in John and the divinity of her mission. Part of that staging was John's march to Orléans. In late April, she left Blois with a convoy of soldiers and supplies. The pompous procession was calculated to strike terror into the English and awe the French. The army avoided the heavily fortified English boulevards in the west of Orléans by bypassing the besiegers in the south, heading for the river crossing near Chessy. From there, the bulk of the escort returned to Blois, while John crossed the Loire with the support of about 200 men. The only obstacle left was the boulevard of Saint-Loup. Despite its small garrison, this fortification could undoubtedly stop the slow-moving supply train. But against all odds, John and her convoy passed the boulevard without incident. While some sources attribute this to a miracle, the medieval French chronicle Journal du Siège d'Orléans offers a more plausible explanation. According to this primary source, the townspeople made a sortie that day, distracting the English in Saint-Loup and allowing John and their supplies to enter Orléans unharmed through the Burgundian gate. Whether this was a planned maneuver or pure chance is unclear. Regardless, John and her soldiers made it to the city and brought much needed supplies. The people welcomed their warrior maid passionately. John was eager to attack the English immediately. However, the bastard of Orléans and the other commanders opted for a more cautious approach and did not want to let a young woman interfere with their business. Unable to persuade the defenders to take action, John decided to provoke the English into a fight. The day after her arrival, she went to the boulevard of Belle-Croix and issued an ultimatum to Sir William Glasdale, who was now in charge of the siege. Glasdale answered that he would certainly not surrender to a cowherd, and threatened to burn her at the stake if he captured her. Despite this, John's plan worked. Although the English did not attack, the people of Orléans, who supported John, pressured the bastard of Orléans to take action. On the 1st of May, he left Blois to collect additional troops. In his absence, John scouted the French positions, and although she was hampered by the masses of her admirers, indeed identified weak spots in the English lines. On the 4th of May, the bastard returned, with the troops from Blois. But much to John's frustration, he didn't believe her when she informed him about her assessment of the situation. Despite her counsel and the additional troops, she was still hesitant to attack. Even when intelligence reached the city that the experienced Sir John Fastolf was approaching with reinforcements for the English, the French leaders didn't want to make a move. Frustrated, John went to rest. Sometime later, John woke with a start. She declared that in her dreams the saints had ordered her to attack immediately. The bastard of Orléans had seemingly had the same idea, as he was already preparing to attack the boulevard of Saint-Loup, the least effective of the English defences and therefore well suited for a demonstration of power. John joined his forces. When the French charged at the boulevard, the heavily outnumbered English garrison put up a fierce fight and held the fortification for 3 full hours. Reinforcements from Saint-Pouer hurried to their aid but were unable to turn the tide, so that most of the defenders were killed in the end, and the boulevard was captured. Bolstered by this success, John promised to relieve Orléans within 5 days. No one could have suspected that she would better that promise by more than a day. The next day, the 6th of May, John and the French soldiers crossed over the river to attack the boulevard of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc. When they arrived, they discovered the English had already destroyed it and retreated to the boulevard of the Augustines. After this bloodless victory, there were 2 possible strategic targets: the northern and western boulevards, which were undoubtedly weaker, or the boulevards of the Augustines, and then the Tourelles. An attack on the southern position was hazardous, but offered a chance to end the siege quickly, in one blow. And time was of the essence, with Fastolf and his reinforcements approaching. This time, the French commanders held their council of war in John's absence, and decided to garrison Saint-Jean-le-Blanc and retreat to the city to rest. However, John had won the trust of the people. She had made it clear that she wouldn't waste unnecessary lives, but also wouldn't shy away from any sacrifice to fulfill her mission. Because of this, the militia, the simple soldiers, and even the men-at-arms followed her when she ignored the decision of the French commanders and ordered an assault on the boulevard of the Augustines. About 4,000 French fighters, allegedly with John and La Hire leading from the front, charged the fortifications in a series of frontal assaults. Fighting was fierce and continued for most of the day, with immense losses on the French side. After many hours, they managed to fight their way up the boulevard and push the defenders back. Finally, exhausted but victorious, they seized the earthworks. The English were now pinned between the Loire and the troops of Joan of Arc. Looking at the disastrous state of their men, the bastard of Orléans and other French leaders now desperately urged John to rest and regroup. But no one listened to the undoubtedly more reasonable counsel of the military leaders. The victories of the last days had earned John the full trust of people and soldiers, and they would follow her unconditionally. On the 7th of May, John rose early and eagerly prepared for battle. First, she readied herself and then roused her troops. It was an easy task, as the people fervently believed that fighting and dying for her was equivalent to fighting and dying for God. Those who fell in battle at Joan of Arc's side were thought to be granted salvation. Their conviction was tested, however, as what was to come would be, in the words of Kelly de Vries, quote, the bloodiest military engagement of the 100 Years' War since the Battle of Agincourt, end quote. While the English were fortifying their position, the French appeared before the boulevard of the Tourelles. They threw everything they had at the earthen fortifications, bombarding them, trying to scale them, and exploiting weak points. But the English held their ground, and the fight continued all day. Amid the chaos, Joan fought with her banner held high, inspiring those around her. But suddenly, an arrow struck between her shoulders and neck, and she had to be taken away for medical treatment. After her wounds were tended to, however, she returned to battle, determined to push through. The men could barely hold themselves upright to fight, and the Bastard of Orléans again suggested postponing the final assault until the next day. But Joan insisted on continuing and retreated to a vineyard to pray. When she returned, she told the soldiers that her visions had promised her the boulevard would fall as soon as her standard would touch it. Although this story probably belongs to the realm of legend, the French indeed pushed forward in a last assault and finally cleared the earthen rampart. The remainder of the English retreated to the Tourelles, which had been made more difficult by the French, who had set several riverboats aflame and driven them under the gatehouse. The heat and thick smoke weakened the English and their defences. Soon after, the Tourelles fell, half ablaze. Although Orléans was not yet free, the most formidable threat had been neutralized. The townspeople quickly restored the destroyed bridge with a wooden construction, and the victorious soldiers marched over it to the city. While the people were celebrating, Joan finally gave herself a break. On the 8th of May, the English soldiers north of the Loire abandoned their boulevards and drew up for battle. The French quickly arrayed themselves too, but Joan ordered them not to attack. After a while, the English turned away and abandoned Orléans altogether. In 10 days, Joan of Arc achieved what experienced commanders had failed to do for months. She lifted the siege of Orléans. Joan became known as the savior of Orléans and was hailed as a legendary hero compared to Hector, Alexander, and Caesar. She became the symbol of France's resistance, and the people of Orléans have adored her ever since, even achieving her canonization in 1920 and celebrating an annual festival on the 8th of May to this day. Joan's reputation attracted countless volunteers and raised French morale considerably. To contemporaries, the victory of Orléans was proof of her divine connection and therefore proof that the French cause was holy. Within 2 months, the French army had reconquered the Loire region, and by the end of June, Joan and the Dauphin were marching for Reims, where Charles was finally crowned King Charles VII of France on the 17th of July 1429. The relief of the siege of Orléans had ended the English advance. The tides of the 100 Years' War were turning. If you enjoyed this video, please consider becoming a Patreon. We're trying to reach our monthly goal of $600, which will help us cover the cost of the extensive artwork in our videos.